Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture, we will get a very quick and brief overview of Russian history in the first part of the 19th century, in which many significant events took place. So, under Catherine, Russia had become this incredible empire expanding from the Baltic to the Pacific, and a major player in European politics. And then the Napoleonic Wars happened. And Russia ended up fighting against France in the Napoleonic Wars, and especially in 1812, when the French army invaded Russia and actually made it all the way to Moscow. You've probably heard of this. This is one of the, sort of great military campaigns of modern history, and is also considered to be one of the greatest defeats in modern history because Napoleon and his army marched all the way to Moscow. They captured Moscow, and then Moscow was burned, supposedly by the retreating Russians, and the French were forced to leave. They had Moscow. They had won, apparently, but they had no supplies, no food. It was getting colder. They were forced to leave, and they just marched out of Russia. They abandoned Russia and lost most of their soldiers because of the extreme weather. And because of this great victory, which was partially military, but also a lot of it was weather-related, Russia became one of the preeminent military and political powers in Europe. And it was now a major, major player in European politics. One of the results of this great victory was that the Russian army actually marched all the way to Paris and was in Paris for a while. And this meant that lots of young idealistic officers were exposed directly to French culture. And they brought that home, and they brought home the ideals of the French Revolution. And Russia was still an autocracy. It was still a monarchy with the monarch as the supreme and only ruler. There was no real constitution. There was no parliament. There was no rule by the people. And this was felt as being a major problem. And then the other issue was the issue of serfdom. Serfdom is similar to slavery. The difference is that serfs are tied to the land rather than to a specific master. So serfs are required to work the land where they live, and then the land can be bought and sold. In theory, you couldn't buy and sell the serfs themselves, but of course, it often happened that serfs were bought and sold. And interestingly, our word slave in English comes from the ethnonym Slav because we had so many Slavic slaves that we use the word Slav to mean slave now in English. And so Russia has this long, long history of bonded servitude and enforced labor. And by the 19th century, this was seen as a real problem. It was seen as both a major moral issue and a major economic and practical issue. And so in December 1825, a group of young idealistic officers occupied Senate Square in downtown St. Petersburg and demanded a constitution and the abolition of serfdom. And this uprising was put down very brutally, and the leaders were exiled or executed. At the time, Russia had no death penalty. It had been abolished, but it was brought back specifically to execute the leaders of this uprising. And this was seen as a really shocking, shocking thing. And it also put an end to open demands for reform for several decades because the other idealistic reformers saw what happened to these Decembrists and were either afraid to try anything or decided that it would be pointless. And so despite growing unhappiness with the lack of a constitution, with the autocracy, and with serfdom, nothing much was done about it for several decades following the Decembrist Uprising. This all came to a head in the 1850s when war broke out between Russia on one side and France, England, and the Ottoman Empire on the other in what is known as the Crimean War, because it took place in the Crimea, from 1853 to 1856. And the war was a humiliating defeat for Russia. And this was shocking to everyone, especially them, because they had been the preeminent military power at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And they were, defeated by France, whom they had routed so thoroughly just a few decades ago. And it brought about a lot of pressure for reforms, which we will talk about in the next slide. The reform that most people saw as the most important and the most pressing was the abolition of serfdom. And this, like I said earlier, was seen as both a crucial moral issue and a major economic and practical issue. Many, many people by this point saw serfdom as a terrible moral evil. And they also saw it as holding back the economy, holding back industrial and scientific progress. And so there was a huge amount of pressure for reform and the abolition of serfdom. And in 1861, the new Tsar, Alexander II, abolished serfdom. And this was considered to be a very, big deal. This was huge. This was a huge, huge thing. At the same time, the abolition of serfdom in Russia, just like the abolition of slavery in the US that happened shortly after that, was good, but it didn't go nearly far enough in some ways because the position of the freed serfs was still very bad. They were freed in such a way that they were often not very free. They were often very much in debt to the landowners and had to continue working the land in order to pay off their debt to their landowners. And they still kind of belonged to the villages. They no longer belonged to the nobility, but they did belong to their villages. And so on a day-to-day basis, they were not necessarily any more free. At the same time, the nobility, the landowners, no longer had any kind of obligation to care for them. And so in some cases, people ended up actually worse off than before. So the abolition of serfdom was both a huge step as far as improving things. Many people saw it as a huge and very important step for making Russia a better place. At the same time, it did not actually bring about a life of cream and roses for everyone, and in some ways made things worse. And in fact, brought about a huge amount of social turmoil and unrest in the latter part of the 19th century.